This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 166 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It is my 2019 travel year in review. I did one of these last year for 2018 and I enjoyed it so much that I am back again to tell you a little bit about the year that was, both in terms of travel and in terms of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. So I hope you enjoy this episode. It's the last brand new episode for 2019, but in the 2 weeks following this, around Christmas and around New Year, I'm actually going to re-release a couple of episodes that are from Christmas and New Year a couple of years back. So I think a lot of listeners won't have heard them. They're from the early days, but I had a listen and they're still well worth listening to. I'm going to add a little intro on the front of them. So to bring anything up to date that needs to be updated. But that's coming up in the next couple of weeks before regular programming of new episodes begins again in January 2020. Gosh, 2020 sounds so, I don't know, science fiction, far distant future, and yet it's mere weeks away. So, first of all, travel year in review. This year I have actually been quite good at documenting the travel I've done on the podcasts. So I am mostly going to direct you back to some episodes about it. So our big trip this year with Mr. Nine was to Thailand and Denmark. And you might remember, if you're a regular listener, that was a weird combination, but for a good reason. So you can go back to episode 150 and you'll hear all about my post-Denmark thoughtful travel debrief. And more recently, I've spent time in Cairns and Queensland, and in episode 160, I have my Cairns and Queensland podcast diary. So you can hear a lot about my travels there, but they were, as usual, fabulous. Wish I could do more, much more of it. But I still have to run the rest of my business and my son has to sometimes go to school. But anyway, we'll see what happens in the future years. Now, onto the podcast. In last year's year in review, I mentioned that the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group had members from 25 countries. Well, I just checked on the kind of survey I keep on the beginning of the group, and we are now up to members from 43 different countries, or at least who live in 43 different countries. In terms of nationalities, it's probably much more than that. So that's pretty exciting. And my statistics from my podcast hosts can tell me now that the Thoughtful Travel Podcast has been listened to in 174 different countries, which I think is super cool. Although, of course, I'm a bit disappointed my podcast is so much more well-traveled than me, but it's still a pretty cool thing. I've actually set my son a school holiday homework task because you can't tell exactly, the list doesn't show which countries haven't been listened to, and yet so he's got to do a bit of a cross-referencing and figure out where I need to chase people down so that I can fill in the whole map. Now, you might remember a few episodes back I said that my big goal for this year, for 2019, was to finish the year having had 250,000 downloads. So at the time of recording, I think it's around 238,000 so far. So we're getting really close to that 250,000 downloads. Just in case, maybe share it with some friends. Or, just tell the world about it, or leave a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, something like that to help me get to that 250,000. Thank you. Now, interestingly, because I looked back on last year's year in review, and in that one, I reflected on how grateful I was that my son's school teacher last year had been so supportive of us traveling, and I pondered what this year would bring us, because you never know. Maybe we'll have a teacher who says, no, you can't take him out of school, or, just be, unhappy about it. But as it happened, it was absolutely fine. This year brought us a teacher who I think has probably travelled even more than we have this year, or at least a similar amount, squeezing these amazing trips into her school holidays. And not only that, she listens to the podcast too. So obviously you can imagine I am A-OK with this one. So hello, lovely Brichelle, and thank you for an awesome year. Now, on to some questions from the group to round out the year. I always like to grab a few questions from listeners, and they've come out of the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. And there's been a really cool, I could talk like for several hours about these questions. I'm going to try and keep it to my usual time though. So first up, I had a question from Rachel. She said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the next upcoming countries that will burst open over the coming few years. So it's a really good question. My first big tip is Georgia. Georgia, the country, not Georgia, the state. It's the reason I say that is because it seems to be all over my feed at the moment, more and more people wanting to go there. And I've been thinking of planning a trip there for the end of next year. In fact, if you have been to Georgia during January or December, let me know, because I'm trying to find out more about how, do things close down a lot over winter? Will we still be able to get out and about enough? It doesn't seem like it will be too cold, but anyway, something to think about. I also think that South Korea is going to take off. Now, I've thought this for years. When I lived in Japan and I visited South Korea, I thought, wow, this is an awesome country. More people should come here. But I saw it advertised recently as the new Japan, and there's some new flights going there from Australia, some extra flights. And I think they're spot on, because it's the only country that is sort of similar to Japan in some ways. It's obviously got its, really different culture as well, but there's quite a lot of similarities. And Japan is becoming, kind of much more well-known and more popular destination these days. So, maybe South Korea is the next one. I also think that a lot of lesser-known cities in China are going to take off. So, for example, a friend of mine recently was in Guangzhou, and after seeing all his posts, I'm like, I really want to go to Guangzhou now. We've all heard plenty about, Beijing or Shanghai, but, there are vast numbers of vast cities in China with all sorts of different attractions and different interests. So that's my tip. And I think similar could happen for countries like Japan and Vietnam, where there's some key centres that people have visited, but there's still a lot that people don't know much about. I also think in the next few years, Eastern Europe needs to, will somehow become as visited as it deserves to be. Countries like the Baltics, like Latvia and Lithuania, they're fabulous places, and they're still not really well visited. More than they used to be, but there's still, plenty of space for more. And the other country that gets on a lot of those lists at the moment, those, emerging destination lists, is Bhutan. And you'll remember I've spoken on the podcast about Bhutan in the past, and I really want to go. So that's maybe why it's on my list. So that's my summary, Rachel. Now, Lynn asked from New Zealand about some information on air points and finding cheaper flights. Just a quick answer for you, Lynn. I checked that New Zealand also has I Know the Pilot. That's my favourite place for finding cheap flights. I get their daily email. I get tempted daily. It's horrible. But if you go to iknowthepilot.co.nz, they will help you out. Lynn also asked about points, and I'm no travel hacker. I just don't know enough about it. But what I do is use things like, I'm a Velocity member, so through Virgin, and they have an online shopping system where whenever I want to buy something online, nearly every shop that I ever need is on there. I can actually log in through their system, and then the points I spend get bonus points. So little things like that. And converting any supermarket points into flying points. That's the kind of thing that I do. So it's not just, when you fly, it's all the time, whenever you're spending money. Now, Sandra asked a really cool question. This could easily be a whole episode or more, but she said, what trends do you see emerging in travel in the 2020s? Gosh, sounds so amazing to think of it as a whole decade. Like greener airlines, the rise of flight shaming, and over-tourism. So my quick summary, because I could talk forever. I think definitely there'll be a much bigger focus on sustainability, like even to the point of I mean, I've seen it already. Hotels that have proper sustainability practices, people will talk about them. They'll be the ones that get the people. And, same with, every other aspect of travel. I think definitely as part of the flight shaming thing, slower travel will become more widely known. Spend a longer time in one destination rather than racing around to tick off 10 so-called bucket list items. And sort of similarly, moving to things like off the beaten path travel or second city travel. This is kind of part of that over-tourism piece, I suppose. So I keep seeing that often. The second city travel is a bit like what I was talking about earlier with lesser known cities in China. So, instead of going to Paris, there's all these other places in France that you might go to. A rise in off-peak and shoulder season travel because of over-tourism, I think. And one of my favorite things that I think is really going to keep growing is that yearning for like learning and experiential travel, people who are traveling and that like intentionally looking for like a transformation or inspiration. They're not just going, it's not just a holiday, it's a trip with, with more purpose. I think also there might be some kickback against the whole flight shaming thing. I find it tricky because, when you live in Western Australia, you can't travel if you don't fly. Flying is important. But at the same time, we need to, climate change demands that we, look at this. But for example, I recently read an article on the importance of tourism in terms of if people stop flying to Africa and tourist numbers fell dramatically, that would increase poverty and decrease conservation of animals. Both of those things are bad. So, I think it's not as simple as let's not fly. That's what I'm trying to say. Ivan asked me, what is my dream destination for 2020? And he got in 2 questions. One activity I'd like to do to get out of my comfort zone. So dream destination, Georgia, Tbilisi, all around Georgia. In fact, definitely not just Tbilisi. I've been reading all around lots of stuff about Georgia and there's lots of cool things to do there. So that is definitely my dream destination because I like to go somewhere that's not so well known yet. And I want to go there before it gets well known. I feel like Georgia is for the 2020s, Georgia is like Iceland was 10 years ago. And now, every second person I know has been to Iceland. Still an awesome place, but it's just, it's well known now. And the out of my comfort zone question, I had to think about this because I am constantly trying to stretch my comfort zone. And things like, languages and talking to locals are things that I really try hard to do. But one thing I really want to do is to do some more walking, like longer hiking kind of trips. I think my son is now definitely old enough to do that kind of thing with me. And I think it is something that I maybe have used the excuse that my son's too young. And now I need to stop using that excuse and look into being more serious about that because I love the idea of it. Haven't really done much. So longer hikes, or a proper hiking trip. That's my idea. Now, Kim asked. Now, Kim, you might remember I've chatted to before, and Kim and her husband Wei are traveling the world constantly. They're fitting in, although they travel slowly, often a month or more in a place, but they're aiming for 50 countries before Kim turns 50 in a few years. And so I think this question reflects that. She said, how do you answer the difficult question, what is your favorite country? And she says, I'm not necessarily looking for a country, unless you have one. I'm more thinking about how to educate people that there's something special about every country. So I think this is a great question because a lot of people, it's a really lazy question to ask a traveler, isn't it? What's your favorite country? Because I personally think, how can you have a favorite country? It's like having a favorite child. Well, actually, I only have one child, so I guess I do have a favorite child, but you know what I mean. So I definitely tend to highlight some of my favorite experiences. I always say I don't have a favorite country, although I suppose Japan is one of my favorite countries easily because I have so many wonderful experiences there. But I tend to highlight some favorite experiences like the Trans-Siberian across Russia or backpacking through Tunisia, spending Christmas in Finnish Lapland. Those are like several of the kind of experiences that I really, really cherish and, feel were really impactful and were just, special and amazing. experiences rather than countries. And if they're still listening, I hope that they ask questions after that. So just tell them it's like deciding on your favorite child, and you can't do that. Sam asked, now Sam, I know, has included in her family 2 kids who are, I think, still under 2, if I'm right. Anyway, really little. So this question makes sense coming from Sam. She says, I'd love to hear more about how you balance thoughtful travel with kids, especially when they are young. And I think this is an awesome question. And I think it's a common assumption that you can't necessarily travel thoughtfully when you have kids, especially young kids. However, I have to say that when my son was young, he was the one who taught me about thoughtful travel, because I had to completely change the way I traveled because I had a young kid traveling with me. And if you've got a couple, then even more so, I think, Sam. So the most important part of that, I think, is slow travel, because if you don't have, rest days with kids where you just kind of hang around and do not much, or if you try and see 3 things in one day, you're going to go absolutely bonkers. So slow travel is something that kids really make you do, and selective. Like, you don't just go and see everything in a place. You be more thoughtful about what you're going to see and why you want to see it. Also engaging with locals, which I always think is a really important part of thoughtful travel. Having kids with you, especially little kids, especially cute little kids, that really helps break down barriers with local people. People always want to talk to people who have little kids with them, or you're at the local playground somewhere, near where you're staying when you travel, and the kids just naturally start playing with other kids. Doesn't matter if they don't speak the language, they all figure that out. And that kind of thing is a great way to get to know local people. And I guess just by the very nature of having kids with you, your experiences may vary a lot. Like the things you choose to do will be different to just sort of standard sightseeing. So I think that, I think traveling with kids can be a really easy way to actually slip into being a more thoughtful traveller. And I think the other thing that parents tend to do, even without thinking about it, but if you can be even more intentional about it, then even better, is to talk to your kids about the experiences both before, all of these, before the trip, during the trip, and then continuing to talk about them after the trip. And talking about those things helps kind of embed that thoughtfulness about them, I think. So, in fact, I'd never really thought about it before, but I wonder if my son hadn't come along, I think it would have taken me much longer to think about being a thoughtful traveller. So they're actually an advantage, I think. So that pretty much sums up the what I wanted to tell you to finish off the new episodes for the Thoughtful Travel podcast in 2019. Over the summer holidays, we are finally going to start recording our kids podcast. So look for that in your podcast player in February, but I will tell you all about it, of course, here as well, because I know many of you will have kids or grandkids that you'd like to share my kids travel podcast with. In the show notes, I will include some photos of our favourite travel moments from this year and some links to the episodes I mentioned early on. And of course, a link to the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. And the show notes for this episode will be at notaballerina.com/166 for episode 166. So thank you very much again for a fabulous year of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I am so, so grateful to my wonderful guests who really make the show something really special, and to my fabulous listeners who talk with me in the Facebook group and elsewhere, but especially there, and, share all of their, experiences and opinions. And it's so wonderful to be able to meet, even if it's only virtually, but it's good enough for me, so many like-minded and interesting people. So I'm really grateful for being able to bring this podcast to you, and grateful for everything that you as listeners and guests do to help me with it. So thank you very much. And as I said, there'll be a Christmas and a New Year episode coming up in your podcast player over the next 2 weeks, so you won't miss out. There's no real break this year because I'm loving it too much, so there's no time for rest. I've got too many interesting episodes lined up for 2020. So for now, thank you very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.